Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is an incredibly social art.
Open source is innovation.
Open source is enabling.
Open source is community.
And open source is weird.
Open source is incredibly important.
Open source is hard.
Open source is engaging.
Open source is collaboration.
Open source is like running the show.
Open source is ubiquitous.
Open source is, well, my life.
And open source is not free.
Before we dive in, let me give you some important reminders. People on the podcast participate as individuals. They do not represent any company or organization. All the thoughts and opinions are theirs. People share their stories and experiences, the way how they went through them and how they remember them, and reflect how those experiences affected their lives, influenced their decisions and their careers back then or ever since.
Welcome to the My Open Source Experience podcast. In today's episode, Phil and I are talking to Jim Hall. Jim is the founder of the FreeDOS project, which is celebrating its 30-year anniversary in 2024. So we are talking about topics such as the importance of a good first contribution experience and the challenges of sustaining a project for over 3 decades, like communication forms and channels, adopting release cycles, and more. Enjoy the show.
Jim, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you're doing in tech right now?
My name is Jim Hall, and my background in open source software is I've been working in open source software since like the mid 90s. I think I first started doing stuff in 1993. Today, we're going to talk about the FreeDOS project that started in 1994, but I've also been doing lots of other work in open source software, especially usability open source software. Professionally, I've been kind of in IT my entire career, systems administration, running Unix, running Linux, going into IT leadership, becoming a CIO in government and higher ed. Right now, I'm a consultant. I do training and workshops, but I also teach some university courses as well in technical writing and technical communication. So I kind of do kind of a lot.
That is a very diverse background. And I'm sure that your tech background also influenced your open source journey. Do you remember how you first learned about open source?
Yeah, I learned about open source software before the term open source. Back then, it was still just free software. And I was an undergraduate physics student, University of Wisconsin, River Falls. And math for physics and chemistry was required some computing in there. So we had to learn Fortran. And so we used the VAX systems and things like that at our university. But hanging around the computer lab, you learn about the other computer systems we had there. And we had a, Unix system. We had a Unix lab. And they had Emacs, new Emacs installed on it. And I got a Unix account, and I kind of started to use Emacs. I thought Emacs was actually really nice, a really nice, powerful editor. And I was thrilled to find that, this is actually, free software, right? Back then, I just thought it was just free as in no cost. But, then I started to realize it really was free as in freedom, which is important to me because as I kind of was going ahead in my undergraduate career, I wanted to explore more about this, Unix environment. And I asked around, can I run a Unix system on my computer at home? And so it was 1993 that I found Linux. Somebody had said, "Oh yeah, there's a new thing called Linux, right? I mean, if you want to buy a Unix system, you're gonna be paid through the nose, but there's this new thing called Linux, and there's a Linux distribution called SLS Linux. It was Soft Landing Systems Linux, and they advertise themselves as like the soft landing for DOS bailouts. And I was a DOS user long time before that, and so I was like, oh, that's me. And so I installed Linux on my computer at home. I dual booted with DOS, and it was like, wow, instantly all the tools that we had on the Unix lab I had at home, including Emacs. And so I used Emacs, for doing all my programming at home. And where I really got into the open source part of that, where actually, you could modify it, because up until then I was just a user. But I did an internship at a mapping company. We did like custom maps. It's kind of like what you do like Google Maps today, but it was for corporate customers. And so I did I did an internship. I did a little bit of coding for them, and I didn't like the editor, and so I asked, can I compile Emacs? And so yeah, you can compile Emacs for that. That'd be okay. And so I brought in Emacs, and I couldn't get it to work. And so I actually, because I had the source code, I actually was able to dig in and figure out why it wasn't compiling, because that was the problem. It just wasn't compiling. So I had to dig in, and even though I didn't know Lisp or anything like that, I was still able to figure out what line was breaking and make a fix that would actually work on our system, do a little bit of research. And then I got it to compile. And so I sent that fix back to the GNU Emacs developers. Yeah, that was the first time I actually contributed to an open source or at that time free software project. That's kind of what got me into thinking is like, this is kind of cool that people can, they'll release these programs. And in the DOS world, you're doing a lot of DOS applications, WordPerfect and things like that. And it's like you buy the program and that's all you get, But now it's like you can download the software and you get the source code too. So if you need to fix it, you can. And so in that case, I was trying to make it work on a system that was kind of an odd corner case Unix system called Apollo. But here I was able to get it to work on Apollo because I had the source code. And because of that was for me just kind of cool. And so that was kind of opened the door to me for, this whole idea of contributing back to some sort of open source software project.
So what got you to change from a physics major to ultimately going into a career of sysadmin IT?
It's interesting. So I did graduate with a physics degree, and I've joked that I've never computed, the eigenvalue of anything since I graduated my physics degree. I don't think I could even define what an eigenvalue is anymore. But I was an undergraduate physics student. I did an internship at my first one was at a research lab in Colorado, looking at solar cell data. And the next year, I went back again to look for, more physics type of internships, and I couldn't find any. It was like, I think a National Science Foundation grants had dried up that year or something. I think there was a funding issue. And so a friend of mine worked at this mapping company, and she's like, well, they're opening up an internship. Do you want to apply for that? And I was like, yeah, actually, I think I'd like to apply for that. It's programming, but I had done programming my entire, basically life, starting with Apple II and whatnot, and I do C programming, and if they're not asking for anything huge, I could tackle that. And they're like, oh yeah, they're looking for little things here and there. Okay, cool. I could do that. That's why I did the internship, was that mapping company, and got along really well with people, and got to know the people in the company and my boss and whatnot. And then when I graduated a year later, they reached out to me and said, hey, you're graduating soon. Did you want a job? We actually have an opening to do server stuff. And I'm like, hey, I've been running Linux like this entire time. So yeah, I know how to run a Unix system. I mean, a home Unix system, but I know how to run a Unix system, and I'm sure I can figure the rest of it out. And I did. I had a very supportive first boss, helping me to, learn and investing and training and whatnot. And just kind of from there, I kind of fell into IT as kind of a career. I just found I really enjoyed, running systems and, making things work, making things better, solving problems through, systems management and whatever else. And eventually stepped into a management role because we had a gap that we didn't have a manager. So it's like, well, I'll step into that role. And that kind of put me in IT leadership path. And so I eventually kind of became a manager, and changed jobs and was a manager somewhere else, and became a director and CIO and eventually in as I said, in higher ed and government. And now I'm a CEO. I run my own company as an independent consultant. And so it kind of all started there, about way back, because I couldn't find a physics internship. And so I kind of did this sort of, I guess, plan B, doing, I'll do programming for the summer. But it sort of became discovered it was sort of a passion of mine, just kind of something I really enjoyed doing.
I want to go back to where you were talking about how you also contributed, I think, as part of your internship, at that company where then you ended up working for after graduation.
Yeah.
Do you remember how that contribution experience was? Like, was it easy? Was it hard? How were the people, the contributors of that project? How did they react to what you were trying to contribute?
I remember having a good reaction to it. I think if I didn't have a good response that first time, I think I probably wouldn't have done anything else. I mean, that, by the way, says volumes about why we need to have a good first experience for first time contributors. I recall that I looked up in the documentation, the README file somewhere, and probably the contrib file, who was the maintainer. And so I emailed that person and said, so here's my situation. I was compiling it on this other system and it didn't compile. And so on my system, I added this. And so I was able to say, here's the patch that makes it work on my system. So, the key there, by the way, was, being polite. I'm not saying, oh, yours is broken. It was just, I couldn't get it to work in this other system. And I made this change to make it work. And here's my patch. And my recollection is that the person basically said, oh, cool, thanks. And then it would have shown up in the next version. And so that was, I recall it was a very good process. My next major one, though, was there was an open source compiler, C compiler, and I wanted to have a compiler for our HP system. I made a fix to get it to work and sent back the patch kind of the same basic way, right? So I tried to compile the system and I couldn't get it to work. And so I made this change. And so here's the change that I made. And that person was, I would say, a little less gracious about responding to it. I mean, they took the change, and that change did make it in the next version. But that person was maybe a little less hospitable to the new contributor. I think in retrospect, that person was probably trying to kind of help me to learn how to make a contribution in something. It was, in terms of providing a patch rather than here's the lines that I changed. But it, that was less cool. I think if that had been my first introduction to the open source world, I might not have been as willing to go back and make another one. And so it's two different ways to have your first introduction. And I think it's sort of, as I said, it kind of, I think, says a lot about, why you need to be welcoming to new users and provide, easy on-ramps for people to get started.
I think almost everyone that we talked to, they said that they either had a good experience, or if they didn't, then they didn't go back for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards, they got a better experience, and then it changed their relationship to open source and the communities. You also mentioned ways of contributing, like creating a new project when something doesn't exist yet. So you did create a new project in 1994, the FreeDOS project, which still exists. So a huge congratulations to the community and you on the 30-year anniversary of the project. It is amazing. Having something around for 30 years, open source or not, that's not trivial and not easy. Creating an open source project and the community and ecosystem around it is challenging enough in itself, but sustaining it for 30 years and, continuing, that is just a whole nother level. You started that project sort of shortly after you first started to contribute to open source. How did you decide to create that project, and how hard was it?
So yeah, it got an interesting start. So backing up, I'd used PCs since the first one, 1981, right? And I had an Apple II that my brother and I taught ourselves how to do programming on, and then we got a PC when the PC came out, and so we used DOS from the early days, and DOS had a lot of great applications, and I used DOS all through the years. Every version that came out, we got a new version of DOS, and DOS 5 I thought was just an outstanding update, because everything was, a lot of things were being put in color, by default. Like the editor was like really flashy. It wasn't this Edlin anymore, and you had a basic environment that was really cool looking. And I was kind of a big DOS user right throughout the 80s into the 1990s. And, I mentioned earlier in 1993 is when I first got into, open source and Emacs. And then I installed, Linux, SLS Linux on my home computer. And so, it's like, what got me though was like, this is a really powerful system. It's Unix, but it runs on my home computer. And when you realize that, Linus Torvalds, was an undergraduate student as well when he made it. And you've got people who are contributing to Linux and the other tools that are on Linux, the GNU tools and whatnot from all over, and releasing it for free. It was just like, that's really cool. Well, I was, even though I ran, I installed Linux on my home computer, I was dual booting. And so I dual boot back into DOS whenever I run. So if I needed to write a paper for class, I was probably booting back into DOS. If I needed to do spreadsheet analysis for my computer labs, definitely I was booting back into DOS for that. And so I was doing DOS a lot. And even though I really liked using Linux, I also still loved using DOS. And I'd written a lot of DOS tools on my own, right? Well, 1994, around, I don't know, March, April, I remember reading a lot of these, magazine articles where they're talking with Microsoft about what the next version of Windows is going to be. And they were saying, well, the next version of Windows is going to completely do away with DOS. Because you need to remember back then, Windows was this shell that ran on top of DOS, right? And so you had DOS and then you installed Windows on top of it. And so it was, Windows 3 was the version back then. It was okay. But it wasn't good. And I didn't like it. It was slow. It was clunky. If one application misbehaved, there goes Windows. Windows is down. Reading these articles, they're like, hey, DOS is going away with our next version of Windows. I was like, wow, if Windows 4 or 3.2 looks anything like Windows 3.1, I want nothing to do with it. I would rather keep running DOS. And so I asked around. I said, hey, has anybody written like a free version of DOS, like an open source version of DOS, kind of like what they did with Linux? And because I don't want to go the Windows route. I don't want to be pushing to Windows. I'd rather keep running my DOS applications. I got lots of those. And people were like, we're not aware of anybody doing that, but that's a great idea, and you should do it. And I was a physics major, not a computer science major, so I didn't know how big of a thing that was. And I always tell people, because I was naive, because I didn't know any better, I thought I can do that. Right? Linus Torvalds had done that with Linux. We could do that with DOS. And I was very excited to do it. Because of that, if you don't know what you don't know, you actually could do a lot. In June 29, 1994, after having had these discussions online, I made this announcement on a news group that said, all right, so let's do an open source or a free version of DOS. And at the time, I didn't know the difference between free software and open source wasn't really a term, but we were calling things open. I didn't know the difference between free and open and public domain. And I thought that maybe public domain was kind of what we're going for, right? Because it's for the public. Everybody should be able to use it. And so the first version of DOS that what became FreeDOS was actually called PD-DOS. And it was also because you had MS-DOS, and you had DR-DOS, and you had PC-DOS, and now we had PD-DOS for public domain DOS, because I also thought that was, kind of a cool thing to do as well. And then it didn't take very long before I realized actually we're not trying to make something public domain. Public domain is a different deal. We actually want to make something that is always going to be open, always going to be free for people to use. And we were already using the GNU GPL for a lot of stuff. And so within like 2 weeks, we changed it to FreeDOS with a hyphen, by the way. And then we eventually dropped the hyphen like a year or two later. And yeah, so I put out iBiblio, or at the time it was Sunsite, it was North Carolina, had an FTP site. FTP was the old file transfer protocol. And if you wanted to download Linux programs, they had a Sunsite at the time, it was now iBiblio, had an archive of Linux stuff. And so I reached out to them and I said, hey, I'm trying to do the same basic thing as Linux, but it's going to be DOS. is there any way that I could get space on your server for DOS stuff? And they said, actually, we have a DOS directory, so we'll create a path for you on that. And so that's how we got our first space on a biblio. We're still using it. And so I shared some programs that I'd written, which were very, very basic, but they did the job. They proved that you could do something. And other people, saw that and they're like, hey, I want to get on that too. And so we had people that joined pretty quickly thereafter. We had somebody from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI, and one of the students over there thought this was kind of a cool idea. And so I think that was Tim Norman. He came in and he wrote our very first version of basically the FreeDOS command com called FreeCom. I shared the programs that I'd written that kind of made the DOS command line better, kind of improved on the DOS command line. I'm not the only person who did that. So lots of other people said, oh, here's my stuff. My stuff does the same thing. And very quickly, we started to collect these tools that replaced or improved on the DOS commands. And that's actually how it started, proving that it can be done, right? You show a very basic proof of concept that, things are working and you can actually make this thing happen. And then people were like, oh yeah, that's cool. Let's here's some stuff that I did that'll kind of add to that. And if I had said, oh, no, I want to do this all myself, then that would have killed it right away. I mean, it would have died. The key there was, hey, great, that's cool, let's add that. And so we put that up on the server and then we make an announcement, hey, we've added some extra stuff. We had lots of very fast moving releases back then. I think, gosh, it might have been like monthly almost for the first couple. We didn't have a kernel at the time. It was just tools, and we kind of thought that was probably as expected. We found some other public domain stuff that people had written on their own long before that kind of did what we needed to do. That was replacing DOS pieces. And so we were adding that into our distribution of what we had now calling FreeDOS. And it was starting to actually very quickly replace the tools that you could have on the user space for MS-DOS. You could actually run this FreeDOS thing on top of an MS-DOS kernel. And it worked really well. And then Pat Villani, who wrote our kernel, he actually had already written a kernel, a DOS-like kernel, for, believe it or not, a Motorola 68000 system. But it was a DOS-like kernel, and he had ported it back to Intel because he was doing embedded systems work. And so he needed that. He just figured it was easier to write basically DOS applications that would run on whatever embedded system he needed if he had a DOS-like kernel. And so he actually reached out to, there was a project called DOS EMU, which is still around. DOS EMU is, despite the name, it's actually more like a virtual machine. And so there's a piece in Linux kernel that they're leveraging that allows you to run DOS applications. And that's how I ran DOS if I was going to be in Linux. If I didn't want to reboot back into actual DOS, I would run DOS EMU and run MS-DOS kernel under that, and with my own tools on top of it, FreeDOS stuff. And Pat Villani reached out to the DOS EMU folks and said, hey, DOS EMU is great. Did you want a kernel? And the DOS EMU folks said, well, we're focusing on the virtual machine part, right? DOS in a window. And so let's, there's actually, Jim Hall's been creating this free DOS system. Why don't you go over there and contribute to them? And so he reached out to me and I was like, it's awesome, right? We have a kernel that actually does a lot of DOS stuff. It actually was very compatible with DOS. It ran DOS applications. And that was just really cool to have this almost fully formed thing like come in and like, here it is. And it was just a really fast growth. And it was entirely because we were always welcoming new people. You want to do something cool, right? Share it. We also, that also meant that we were including a lot of stuff in our DOS distribution that was actually much further beyond DOS. I mean, we took the attitude at the time of MS-DOS was kind of limited. They didn't really want to make it, very big. But we're doing something really great. And, we're kind of took what we kind of thought was the Linux model at the time, which is let's make it bigger and better. And so that means if somebody's got a tool that they think is cool and someone else thinks is cool, then we'll put it in. And we'll put in our distribution. And so we really we're trying to like really open the door like pretty wide. So that was kind of the opening. For me, it's always just, I always just kind of like looking back in the origin there because it was just really fast moving and just really kind of opening the doors to a lot of people. Finding ways to say yes, I guess is how I'd say it today.
It sounds like that when you started the project, there was a big organic growth because people were very excited about what you were doing. Everyone had ideas and use cases for it. I would assume that it must have felt overwhelming after a little while, like you're being welcoming and friendly and saying that, oh, this is great, bring your stuff. But then how do you coordinate a release? How you're making sure that what goes into whatever new version you're putting out that is usable, consistent. And these days, we are still using words like backwards compatible and providing a good user experience onwards. So how hard was that to start to coordinate with all the people who almost instantly showed up and said, this is cool. I wanna do stuff here too.
Yeah, so initially, and it is hard to coordinate all that. And so initially, it was emailing people, and then we tried to put stuff back onto Usenet, right? Usenet was the discussion board at the time. And so we used one of the groups. We did a lot of stuff there. And so we talk about FreeDOS stuff in that group. And then eventually our project coordinator at the time was M. Hamilton. And I think he's the one who set up the first mailing list that we had. And that is really where we had our conversations. And so we still have a mailing list today. Probably one of the few projects that still relies on a mailing list, as opposed to
Linux.
Yeah, I know.
Still there.
Do they really? Are they still a mailing list? Oh,
OKML still there.
All right. And so, yeah, so mailing list, we have discussions on the mailing list. And so somebody's like, hey, I just learned about this project and I have a program that I use and I think it's kind of cool. And so we kind of talk about it there. And the challenge is that in any kind of mailing list, once you get any kind of size on the group, you really can't shoot for 100% agreement, right? You can say, oh, so-and-so has this new program. Can you add it to FreeDOS? And you're never going to get the entire group say, oh, yes, let's do that. Or no, that's not a good thing. That's not something we should add. You're never going to get 100% agreement. So we really kind of went for, what's the consensus of the group, right? Or, as we talk about it, it's like, are we hearing more yeses than nos? And so, okay, then that's probably enough. We'll just add it to the distribution.
Rough consensus in running code. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And always with the plan of like, well, if we need to, we can just take it out later if we don't decide no one's using it. And that ends up, by the way, being really hard to take stuff out. But, you try to have that conversation on the mailing lists. And over time, the mailing list changed to, eventually move to SourceForge for their mailing lists, but you still have conversations on the mailing list. And over time, as people kind of leave the project and you start to have a little fewer people in the project, and we still have a certain number of people that are still active, but it's a lot less than it was, let's say, in 2000. You still need to talk about things, but now you don't need as many lists, right? So we used to have like 4 or 5 email lists, and now we're down to 2. One that's FreeDOS user, which is explicitly or only for people who want to ask questions about FreeDOS and how do I use this or how do I do that or how do I set it up on whatever. And so that's a great FreeDOS user question. If you're a developer, if you're working on a program, you need help on something, or you want to really, announce a new program, then we have a mailing list called FreeDOS Devel, and that's a great place to announce your program. But also you have to recognize that not everyone's going to go to a mailing list. I mean, especially it's 2024, right? So there are other places that people are going to have conversations. And so there's a certain amount of like chasing the people where they are, right? So I think it would be bad for a project to say, thou shalt not talk about this anywhere else except on our email list. You do need to go where people are, right? And so we have a very vibrant Facebook group. where people are talking about things that they're doing with FreeDOS. We'll ask questions about FreeDOS. We have a lot of people talking about it there. We have a Fauceton where if we announce something, we'll put it out there. Not a lot of conversation on Fauceton. And there's another web forum, which is unrelated to FreeDOS, but a lot of FreeDOS conversation happens because it's a forum about DOS. And so people will talk about stuff there and even sometimes announce projects over there without being a member of our email list. And so if you want to announce stuff on the website because somebody has made something that we use, you need to be part of those forums and pay attention to them. And so in terms of where we talk about FreeDOS, it does move around a little bit. It's not a constant, like we will only talk about it on the mailing list. We still, as I said, we still have some people who are working on FreeDOS, and we have people that are releasing new programs and new distributions. In fact, Jerome Shadell is one of our developers, and he does our distribution wrangling. He also, he wrote the FreeDOS installer. He completely updated the FreeDOS installer when he took on making the FreeDOS distribution. He also had this great idea that I loved, which is, rather than just make one release and that's all you get until the next big release comes out. Let's make something a little more frequent, because the problem is that FreeDOS, DOS stopped being a moving target in 1995, right? That's when Microsoft did what they had promised they were going to do, and we're going to get rid of DOS, and that was Windows 95, which it turns out was not a bad operating system. That's everything. There was a DOS built into Windows 95, and people talk about a DOS 7. It's not really a DOS 7. Even though it's labeled that way. It's, DOS 6.2.2 was the last version of DOS. And so eventually you're going to reach compatibility with MS-DOS 6.2.2, and you don't really need to have as frequent of releases anymore. What you're getting with new releases is not really a new kernel, but because that hasn't changed in a while, but you're getting new programs and new versions of programs and things like that. And so we don't need to have a frequent release schedule like we used to have. It's not like, I run Fedora Linux, and there's a new version of that every 6 months because a lot of stuff changes. So, Jerome realized that, we have a pretty slow release cycle, but we still do have other programs that are getting released. So what if we had this monthly release? And so he made this monthly release that if you're a FreeDOS developer, you can grab the monthly release and try it out. And my new program, does it work with, and that way, as people are releasing new versions, we can still see those new versions come up in those test releases. And then eventually we're going to get to a point where we're feeling like, this is a good place for this release. And we're gonna make that version a 1.2, for example. I mean, right now, I'm sorry, 1.3 right now. So we'll make a 1.4 or maybe a 2.0 at some point for FreeDOS based off of that monthly release, because that's a great way to do it. And so that's one of the things that's happening today is you get these new ways of looking at how we do development and new ways to kind of push things forward. That's just one of the things I like seeing going on right now.
This is very interesting because I work with open source communities as a community manager, supporting them, trying to figure out, how to build up both the community as well as the ecosystem, how not to disrupt that ecosystem, or at least not too badly, to make sure that people find the project, have a way to join, and are able to stick around. Now, when it comes to things like communication, like chat tools or mailing lists, different communities prefer different things. And one thing that we are trying to encourage them to do is to pick something and try to stay there, because if the community fluctuates around tools and chat platforms, and we have just more and more popping up almost on a daily basis these days, then you're fragmenting the community and the ecosystem, and that's bad for you. So we're trying to talk to the communities and encourage them to figure out something and keep it to be stable. Now, obviously, FreeDOS has been around for 30 years now. So whatever you did and jumping around tools and trying to figure ways out, it didn't kill the project. Did you ever have challenges that you picked a new communication platform and it didn't work out, and then people got confused where things are? So what is your experience with that evolution and trying different things out?
Yeah, and we have tried some, a couple things here and there, like, but like we set up a Slack system at one point, and nobody really uses that. And so, it's like we're trying to funnel people to the mailing lists. I mean, that is the place where we try to have everything happen. We just try to follow like announcements and things like that on this other forum I mentioned, and but discussion happens naturally on the Facebook group. What's been bad, I mean, it is always like, how do you keep the community together, right? And so what's bad for a community, I totally agree, is that if conversation like gets split up, right? And so there was this period for a while where, and I don't know what started it, but people would have off-list conversations, and they would talk about things, and they would email, like they'd email somebody, and they'd have a conversation about something there, and then you'd find out about it sometime later. It's like, oh yeah, we've been doing this or that, and it's like, well, why aren't you sharing that with the list? That'd be great for us to know, right? Like somebody recently, like we do this. We also try to do this thing where we every month or every other month, we try to do a video call. Now we're in the Zoom era, where we kind of at least get to know each other as more than just an email. But we always try to bring those conversations back to the list, right? So we talk about something technical, we'll bring it back to the email list. But it was in one of those calls that I learned that somebody was like, oh yeah, I'm working on this or that. And I'm like, oh, you should be sharing that in the email list. And I'm like, oh, I've been talking to so-and-so about it. I'm like, but share that with the mailing list, right? Like, don't just like share one version with somebody and say, oh, you try this out, and then when it works, then we'll try it with more people. It's like, no, go release it wide, right? Make sure everyone knows about this. And so, it's like you find those things, you're like, please bring that back to the list, because that is a killer for community. And I think we're still kind of feeling the after effects of that. I mean, we would try to push more and more stuff back to the email list. Certainly whenever people would email me for different reasons. And sometimes if you have never, not even part of the email list, you just like, oh, I just discovered FreeDOS because I learned about it in college class, or I read an article about it and I wanted to ask you about this or that. I'm like, all right, that's not an email list question because you're not on the email list. But if somebody who is part of the email list, ever emailed me a question, I'll reply back to them, but I'll put it back on the email list. It's like, all right, so you asked this question, and so here's my answer about it. And then we'll talk about it in the mailing list. Whenever I see stuff like that happen, I try to push it back to the mailing list, because that's where we need to talk about it, right? We can't have a community if it's just like islands of people, right? It needs to be, I totally agree with you. It needs to be the community needs to talk about this. And so that's absolutely what you need to have. I think that you've got sort of the younger generation that not so much in the mailing lists. And so I think that's why we're seeing more general user questions happening on our Facebook group, because that one's quite active. People asking questions about, oh, how do I do this or that? And a lot of them are questions of people who are clearly haven't used DOS back in the era because they probably weren't alive. And so they're asking questions that are kind of basic, and that's okay. And it's a very open group for people to say, oh yeah, well, here's how you do it, or here's how you do this or that. Here's an article about it, to be able to answer those questions. And so, having, I would say the non-technical conversation happening on another platform is totally cool. But definitely, if you're having a developer conversation, that needs to happen on the mailing list, because you're trying to keep that developer community going for that specific reason.
Yeah, corpus of common knowledge.
Did you ever get your finger on like what triggered that more private conversations happening when you started to recognize that? Was that like another generation popping up who were less accustomed to mailing lists, or was there some other reason that sort of encouraged people to have more back channel communications? If you ever were able to have at least best guesses about what might have happened.
Yeah, I never really like sat down and tried to figure out why it was happening. I was just trying to kind of get it back to going to the right direction. But I guess if I were to look back on it, I would say that the names that stick out to me is the people who are emailing me. I would say a number of those are people who I don't think had worked in an open source project before. And so to them, being part of a mailing list and having conversations in the open where someone else might jump in and say, oh, that's not the right way to do it, and maybe not do it in a way that's completely gracious. Maybe that was scary to them, or maybe they just weren't used to that. And so to them, I think it made probably some sense in their head to just have that conversation off list. But again, it's like, I'm always going to put that back on the list. I'm going to just have that conversation back on the list because that's where it needs to be. But yeah, I would say it's probably just people that were new to the concept, new to the process about how that is supposed to happen. And they would just have these off-list conversations, and sort of just maybe the more people they reached out to, the more these off-list conversations happened. Maybe that was part of it, but I don't really know.
I was asking because I've been working with the same challenge, like having people to do off mailing list and off community communication channel communications, and that kind of matches to what you said in terms of a lot of the people not having prior open source experience. Besides, when you're involved, included in that conversation, putting it back on the mailing list, have you found any other ways to try to make people understand why it is important that they do all the project related conversations on the mailing list, and how to make them feel more comfortable with doing that? Because I've tried a lot of things and still not as much progress I would have hoped for.
In a way, I'm kind of glad to hear you say that, because I was going to say, if you know the recipe, let me know.
Okay.
We did a website redesign recently, and one of the things I did there was I tried to be very intentional with directing people back to the mailing lists. And so if you go to the new FreeDOS website, there's in our banner at the top of the page, it has ask a question. And it's not pointing you to me, it's pointing you to the mailing lists. And it even says, typically low volume, so it's not likely to fill up your inbox. And there's a big blue button that says subscribe. Makes it very easy to join the mailing list. And so, that's kind of one way I'm trying to get people to go there. We also have other forums that we list there as well, because, kind of have to have it. And there's also, the Facebook group is there, and the Mastodon and things like that. But, we're trying to, I guess I'd say, sort of de-emphasize those in favor of trying to push people over to the main mailing list, which is why that's more prominent on the website with the subscribe button, things like that. I don't know, maybe the next step would be to try and create a sub page for the other forums, so that way on the ask a question page, it's only seeing the mailing list. Maybe that'd be my next step. I don't know, it's sort of the balance of like user experience with the website and still trying to get people to go the right direction. So maybe we'll see.
If you look back at this past 30 years, is there one thing that you would mention that was key to keep this project running and the community running for 30 years?
Gosh, there's like no one thing I can point to that was key to keeping it going. I would say, just in general though, that having a community that is engaged, that wants to do cool new stuff, I think is a really cool part of it. And I think when I say cool new stuff, I also mean people are trying to add stuff to FreeDOS that was not part of DOS, right? We shouldn't be limited by the original DOS. And if you look at our distribution, we have this thing for the long time, we've had this concept called base. And that's the part where it's we're going to isolate all the stuff that was original DOS, right? MS-DOS, basically, in this base thing. But we also have a whole bunch of other packages that are going beyond. Where people are getting FreeDOS to do stuff that original DOS didn't do. And I think that is a really cool piece about one thing that's really kept us going. Is don't be limited by your idea of DOS from 1994, right? I mean, think about what DOS could be. I don't think anyone on the FreeDOS list has ever had any kind of idea that DOS will become the next computing platform in the year 2000 and beyond. I don't think anybody ever thought that was going to be the case, but let's not let that be our limiter. And so you've getting people that are trying these new things on FreeDOS that, I mean, DOS just wasn't designed to do. There was somebody who did a really cool memory driver that can access like gobs and gobs of memory and a RAM drive. And it's like to access memory that you shouldn't be able to access. And I can't even imagine how you could fill that up because you're going to boot your machine and spend the next couple of minutes just filling the RAM drive with things. But it's still just a cool thing, right? And so I think that's the important thing about an open source software project is not boxing yourself in too much, is to always be willing to expand what the project is about, right? Why are we doing this? That's one thing, but what stuff can it do? And if somebody comes along and says, "Hey, I've done something that I think is kind of neat," celebrate that, right? Oh, that's excellent. And then accept it, right? Put that into the project. In a different type of project, you're going to have to include that in your code. FreeDOS is a distribution of a bunch of different programs. And so we try to find ways to include, cool stuff like that. It's really this idea. I think so many people on the FreeDOS project have basically shared this idea of let's try something cool. Let's try something that you couldn't do on DOS. If I were going to point to one thing, I would say it's sort of that sense of exploration. Let's just try something new.
Very cool.
I think that's an amazing reminder to just tell people that whatever the project can do today, that's not the limit, and always be open-minded and forward-looking and look for the next thing, even if it's unexpected and doesn't make sense to you at that point. But from the project's perspective, it's just one cool new thing that it couldn't do before, or you didn't know it could do before. Can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and nothing to do with open source?
I do video games and things, and that's one thing. But in terms of I like to play them rather than make them. But I think for me, something that's not tech related, I guess, so much is when I was an undergraduate. I did not like writing. You asked me to write a paper, I'm not going to do well. And it was only when I got into professional life that I actually started to like writing, because my first boss would encourage me to write everything down. And about 10 years ago, I got a master's degree in technical writing. And it really lit for me a new kind of enjoyment in writing. And so I do a lot of technical writing. And so it's not quite away from tech, but I do a lot of technical writing. And so I was a correspondent on opensource.com until they effectively stopped publishing about a year ago. I used to write a lot of articles for Linux Journal. I used to write a lot of website articles. In fact, I love tech writing so much that I wanted to keep writing about tech writing. I mean, I love writing about Linux, about programming, about open source software, and I do a lot of articles about that. But I wanted to write about writing, if that makes sense. I was trying to find somewhere that I could do that. And I couldn't find a website that was like that. I mean, opensource.com, for example, is a great website if you want to write about Linux, and they would run any article that was about open source software, about Linux, about programming, about whatever. And I wanted to have that same kind of experience, but about tech writing. And I could not find anywhere that had that kind of community that was writing about writing. And so something you may not know about me is that I actually started a website that did exactly that. So I started technicallyrewrite.com, which is a free website for people to write about writing. And it's just kind of cool to kind of see that happening. And that's kind of my thing. It's like away from open source software, it's just writing about writing. I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I teach technical writing, and that's why, because I just kind of enjoy technical writing. So I guess that's my thing. If I were to pick one thing, that's probably it.
Thank you for sharing that story. I think that is a great reminder for everyone that just because at one point in time you were not good at something or you didn't like it, that doesn't mean that it's just in the trash and you would never pick it up again. And how things just come around, then you're like, all of a sudden, I love writing now. And I would have never thought that's ever going to happen to me. So that's pretty cool.
Cool. Thanks.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments section of the platform where you're following the podcast. This season is full of very interesting topics. For instance, open source licenses, culture within communities as well as companies, mentorship programs, open source within companies, or in other words, why does HR have to know what free and open source software is? Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
That was my first experience.
Oh, I loved it. Y'all had me telling stories that I haven't even thought about. And
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
Like, I will have coffee with the two of you any day for the rest of my life. Like,